Welcome to the second week of our series, When God is Silent. And before we get into the study this week, I just want to quickly remind you of our goals for this study. Number one, you will have language to express your frustration and doubts in the midst of God's silence. We talked about that last week. Number two, you will learn that God's silence does not mean that God is absent or powerless. He can be trusted even in the silence. And number three, you will see the importance of being part of a community of faith. Joy is magnified when we can share it, and pain is made a little more bearable when we know that we are not alone. And now I want to quickly remind you that in order for the small group to be a successful experience, everyone needs to invest in the group and honestly engage with the material. To help create a safe environment for that to happen, please keep in mind the following ground rules. Number one, confidentiality. What's said in the group stays in the group. Number two, listen to each other. Wait for others to finish before you start thinking about how you want to respond. Number three, pause. Don't rush to fill the silence. Number four, no side conversations. Number five, no fixing. Number six, no rescuing. Number seven, be self-aware. Contribute, but don't dominate. And number eight, use I statements. Okay, now that we've taken care of those details, I'm going to hand it over to your host to check in and get things started.
We're born with a pretty strong sense of justice and fairness. It's something we don't have to teach our kids. Around my house, the words, "that's not fair," are pretty frequently heard. There's a lot of unfairness and injustice that happens in Joseph's story. I want you to read the story together, and as you do so, I want you to do two things. First, I want you to watch for examples of unfair treatment in the story. Let me give you one that actually happens earlier but creates a pattern in Jacob's family. When Jacob, the father in this story, was a young man, he fell in love with Rachel. Rachel's dad agreed to let Jacob marry Rachel if Jacob worked for him for 7 years. But on the wedding night, he gave Rachel's older sister to Jacob instead. That's not fair. Now, Jacob still wanted Rachel and agreed to work another 7 years to marry her as well. However, after they were married, Rachel couldn't have children. And what made it worse is that her older sister, Jacob's first wife, could and did. And that doesn't seem fair. Eventually, God allowed Rachel to have children and she gave birth to Joseph. But later, while giving birth to her second son, Benjamin, she died. And again, this doesn't seem fair. As you read the story, I want you to look for other things that would seem unfair to the characters involved. Second, I want you to think about who you most identify with in the story, and why do you identify with them? Go ahead and read the passage now. The coldness of Joseph's brothers is remarkable to me. The passage indicates that after they threw him into the cistern, they sat down and ate a meal together. Later on in the story, we learn that they could hear Joseph begging to be rescued, but that didn't disturb their dinner. They just kept eating, ignoring their brother. Joseph's brothers not only betrayed their responsibility to protect Joseph, they caused his pain. You might have experienced something like this. Someone close to you betrays your trust, fails in their role, or doesn't meet your expectations. And that really hurts. It's not fair. But there's another person in this story who fails to respond to Joseph's begging. God. God is completely silent. I'm sure Joseph begged God to rescue him, but nobody comes to his rescue. And that hurts even more. After all, our friends and family are only human. They're imperfect. We expect them to fail at some point. But God, He's supposed to be powerful, good, loving. The location of this betrayal is interesting to me as well. Dothan is mentioned only one other time in the Bible. In 2 Kings, the king of Aram declares war against Israel. However, God keeps informing his prophet Elijah where Aram was setting up their ambush, so the Israelite armies kept avoiding the trap. And eventually the king of Aram figures out what's going on, discovers that Elisha is in Dothan, and sends his armies to capture him. I want you to read the passage and see what happens. Same location, same basic prayer, God, help me, yet two very different results. We don't know why God responds in different ways in similar situations. We don't often get to see the end of the story. We do know how Joseph's story ends. God uses his brother's hatred and ill intentions for good. And this is the way that God gets Joseph into Egypt and eventually into a position of influence that will allow him to oversee a plan that will save his family from starvation. But Joseph doesn't know that. All he knows is that he's alone. His brothers have betrayed him. God is silent. He was alone at the bottom of a cistern. He's alone and without power in a foreign country. And he must have wondered how his dreams were ever going to come true. Honestly, I'm not sure it would always be helpful to know God's plans. I think I would still protest, couldn't God accomplish this goal without causing me so much pain? Isn't there another way to accomplish this same purpose? Jesus prayed that prayer. When he knew it was time for him to be arrested, beaten, and crucified, he went with his disciples to the Mount of Olives to pray. He asked 3 of his closest companions to support him in his sorrow, but they failed. They fell asleep. Jesus' friends failed him, and he was all alone. He knew the Father's plan, and he knew the pain he would have to go through to accomplish that plan, so he pleaded, "My Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering away from me, if there's any other way." Jesus knows what it's like to be abandoned and betrayed by those who are closest to him. He knows what it is like to feel abandoned by God. And he has promised to be with us always, even when it feels like we are completely alone, even when God is completely silent. Matt Maher talks about this reality in his song, "You Were on the Cross." Take a listen to it now.